The first thing the samurai heard wasn't a war cry. It was a whistle, a sharp, unnatural scream cutting through the sky, high, piercing, wrong. For a moment, no one moved. No drums, no challenge, no name called into the wind. Just that sound, growing louder. And then, the sky exploded. Fire and iron tore through the shoreline as the first Mongol bombs struck. Blinding flashes lit the coast. The ground shook. Men were thrown into the air before they could even draw their blades. This was not a battle. This was something they had never faced before. On the shores of Hakata Bay, warriors trained for honor stood frozen in chaos. Their entire lives had been built around a single truth. Face your enemy, declare your name, and fight with dignity. But there was no enemy to face. Only smoke, only fire, and only death falling from the sky. Among them stood Takezaki Suenaga, a samurai raised to believe that war was personal, that every fight was a test of skill, courage, and honor. He stepped forward, hand gripping his sword, ready to call out his name. No one answered. Instead, the arrows came. A storm of black arrows cutting through the air in perfect coordination. Not one-on-one, not fair, not honorable. Hundreds, falling at once. Men collapsed before they could even move. Shields shattered under the pressure. Armor meant for duels failed against the sheer force of numbers. And then came something worse. Small, round objects rolled across the sand. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, thunder. The explosions tore through the battlefield, ripping through shields and bodies alike. Fire erupted. Smoke swallowed everything. The sound alone was enough to break a man's focus. Tetsuhao. The Mongol thunder bombs. Weapons that did not care who you were or how well you fought. This was war without rules. Takezaki charged. Through the smoke, through the chaos, through the fear, he pushed forward, blade cutting into the first enemy he reached. Blood spilled, steel met flesh. For a moment, it felt like the world he understood, but only for a moment, because the enemy did not fight like him. They moved together. Signals passed through drums and flags. Commands traveled faster than thought. Units advanced, retreated, and struck again with precision. This was not an army. This was a system. For every Mongol that fell, more stepped forward. No hesitation, no pause, no fear. The samurai line began to break. Not because they lacked courage, but because courage was no longer enough. The coastline turned into chaos. Villages behind them burned as Mongol forces pushed forward without stopping. Smoke rose into the sky, turning day into shadow. The sound of war did not fade. It grew. Takezaki looked around. Men he had trained with, gone. Warriors who believed themselves unstoppable, falling. And in that moment, the truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a fight for honor. This was a fight to survive. By nightfall, the battlefield was unrecognizable. The sea carried the dead. The land burned, and the warriors who had once stood with certainty now stood on the edge of something far worse than defeat. They were facing annihilation, far beyond the smoke, across the dark water. The fleet still waited, hundreds of ships, at thousands of soldiers, and at the center of it all, Kublai Khan, watching, calculating. This had only been the beginning, a test, and the result was clear. Japan was not ready. But something had changed. The samurai were learning, slowly, painfully. They were abandoning the old ways, because next time, the enemy would not come to test them. They would come to end them. And next time, survival would be the only thing that mattered. The fires had barely faded, but the samurai had already begun to change. What happened on that shore was not just a defeat, it was a warning, a brutal, undeniable truth that their world, the world of honor, of duels, of single combat, could no longer protect them. Takezaki Suenaga stood among the survivors, his armor cracked, his body exhausted, his mind racing. Around him, men didn't speak, they didn't shout, they didn't celebrate survival. They understood something far more dangerous. The enemy they had just faced would return, and next time, they would not hold back. Far across the sea, that decision had already been made. Kublai Khan did not see resistance. He saw weakness, a land that could be broken, a people who could be overwhelmed. What had begun as a test was now becoming a plan. Orders were given, resources gathered, and across the vast Mongol Empire, something massive began to take shape. 7 years passed, but this was not peace. This was preparation. Across Japan, the samurai abandoned the idea of waiting for battle. They began to reshape the way they fought, not as individuals, but as a force. Along the coastline of Hakata Bay, thousands of men worked without stopping. Stone by stone, day after day, they built a defensive wall stretching across the shore, solid, unforgiving, designed to stop ships from landing and force the enemy into controlled combat. This was not their tradition, but tradition had almost destroyed them. Takezaki returned to the coast, no longer the same warrior who had once rushed forward without hesitation. Now he watched, calculated, learned. He trained with others, not as rivals, but as units. They studied Mongol tactics, their formations, their signals, their weapons. Drums, flags, coordinated strikes. The enemy did not fight alone, so neither would they. And then, the horizon darkened again. At first, it was distant, a shadow over the sea. But it grew and grew, until the ocean itself seemed to disappear beneath it. The Mongol fleet had returned, but this time, it was no raid. It was an empire moving. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers. An army so vast it stretched beyond sight. Warriors from across Asia, Mongols, Chinese, Koreans, all under one command. This was not an invasion. This was annihilation. From the walls of Hakata, the samurai stood ready. No speeches, no challenges, no wasted movement. They had learned. When the Mongol ships pushed toward the shore, expecting another easy landing, they met resistance. Arrows rained down from above. The wall held. Ships struggled to get close enough. Soldiers were forced to disembark under fire. Formations broke before they could stabilize. For the first time, the Mongols were being slowed, not stopped, but challenged. And when night fell, the samurai made their move. Small boats slipped silently into the water, cutting through the darkness toward the Mongol fleet. No armor shining, no banners raised, just shadows moving across the sea. Takezaki climbed aboard one of the ships, his blade ready, his breathing steady. There were no words exchanged, only action. Strikes were fast, precise, brutal. Guards fell before they could react. Chaos spread across the decks. And before the Mongols could respond, the samurai were gone. Night after night, the attacks continued. Sleep disappeared. Fear replaced control. The Mongol army, once unstoppable on land, now found itself trapped at sea, surrounded by an enemy that refused to fight by their rules. The balance was shifting, slowly, but undeniably. Yet even as hope began to rise among the defenders, something else began to change. The wind. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the air, a movement that barely mattered. But Takezaki noticed, because after everything they had faced, nothing could be ignored anymore. The sea was no longer calm. The sky was no longer clear. And deep down, every man on that wall felt it. Something was coming. Not an army, not a weapon, something far more powerful. And this time, no one would be able to stop it. At first, it felt like nothing, just a shift in the air, a quiet change that most men would have ignored, but not the samurai, not anymore. From the stone walls of Hakata, Takezaki Suenaga watched the horizon. The sea moved differently now, slower, heavier, as if something beneath it was rising. The wind brushed against his armor, then pulled harder, sharper, colder. Out at sea, the Mongol fleet remained anchored. Thousands of ships spread across the water, waiting for the moment to strike again. They had been slowed, but not stopped. Their numbers still dwarfed anything Japan could resist. They believed time was on their side. They believed they would win. Above them, the sky began to change. Clouds rolled in, thick and fast, swallowing the light. The horizon darkened into something unnatural, a deep or heavy gray that pressed down on the sea. The air grew dense. Breathing felt harder. The world felt wrong. Still, the Mongols held their position. They had faced storms before. They did not fear the wind. But this was not wind. By nightfall, the sky broke. The storm did not arrive slowly. It struck, a violent force tearing across the ocean with unstoppable power. Waves rose like walls, crashing against the fleet with brutal impact. Ships that once moved in perfect formation were thrown apart like fragments. Ropes snapped, masts shattered, commands vanished in the roar of thunder. Lightning tore through the sky, illuminating the chaos below. Ships colliding, men falling, fire breaking out as lanterns overturned. The sea turned black with movement, swallowing everything that touched it. This was no longer a battle. Oh, this was destruction. Takezaki stood on the wall, gripping his blade, watching the impossible unfold. The same army that had arrived with absolute confidence was now fighting for survival. Men were thrown into the water, their armor dragging them under before they could even scream. Ships slammed into one another, splintering wood, crushing bodies. The fleet that had once covered the horizon was now breaking apart, piece by piece. And still, the storm grew stronger. Wind howled across the sea, ripping sails apart, tearing ships from their anchors. Waves rose higher, crashing harder, until the ocean itself seemed to rise against the invaders. The Mongols tried to hold formation. They tried to fight it, but there was nothing to fight. No enemy to strike, no strategy to follow. Only chaos, only force, and only the sky turning against them. Hours passed. The storm did not weaken. It consumed. Entire ships disappeared beneath the waves. Others were driven into the rocky shore, smashing apart on impact. Fire and water clashed as flames spread across broken decks before being swallowed by rain. The invasion was collapsing. And when the first survivors reached the shore, the samurai were waiting, not with honor, not with ceremony, but with certainty. Takezaki moved forward, no hesitation left in him. This was no longer about proving himself. This was not a duel. This was survival. Blades struck fast. Arrows cut through the rain. The enemy that had once overwhelmed them was now broken, disoriented, exhausted, desperate. They did not fight back as warriors. They ran, but there was nowhere to go. Behind them, the sea. Ahead of them, death. By the time the storm began to fade, the Mongol army was no longer an army. It was ruin. Broken ships stretched across the coastline. Bodies drifted between shattered wood. The banners of an empire lay tangled in the wreckage, soaked, torn, forgotten. Takezaki stood in the silence that followed, his breath heavy, his body still, his eyes fixed on what remained. He understood. This was not victory, not the kind he had been taught to seek. No blade had decided this battle. No warrior had claimed it. This was something else. Far beyond the broken fleet, across the endless sea, the truth was already on its way. Kublai Khan would hear of this. His greatest invasion. Destroyed, not by strength, not by strategy, but by something no empire could command: the wind. And history would remember it as something more than a storm. Kamikaze, the divine wind. But the story was not over. Because empires do not forget defeat, and Kublai Khan was not finished. When the storm finally ended, there was no victory, no cheers, no celebration echoing across the land. Only silence. A deep, heavy silence that settled over the shores of Hakata. The kind that follows something too large to understand. The sea, once filled with the power of an empire, now carried only fragments. Broken ships drifted aimlessly. Torn sails moved with the dying wind. Bodies rose and fell with the waves, as if the ocean itself refused to let them rest. Takezaki Suenaga walked slowly along the coastline. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from truth. This was not the victory he had imagined. There had been no final duel, no moment where skill decided fate, no honor in the way he had once believed. What stood before him now was something far different: survival. Around him, the samurai moved quietly. Some searched the wreckage. Others stood still, staring out at the horizon, not in triumph, but in disbelief. Because deep down, every man who had survived knew the same thing. They had not won this battle alone. The storm had chosen, the wind had decided, and without it, everything would have been lost. Far across the sea, the truth reached the Mongol Empire. The invasion had failed. Kublai Khan listened in silence. No anger, no immediate command, just stillness. Because for the first time in his rise to power, something had stopped him. Not an army, not a rebellion, not a rival. Something he could not control. For a man who had built his empire on power and precision, this was something far more dangerous than defeat. It was uncertainty. Years passed, but the memory of that failure did not fade. And Kublai Khan did what powerful men always do. He tried again. Another fleet was prepared. Another army gathered. Another invasion set in motion. But history does not always repeat itself the way men expect. Because when the Mongols returned, the sky returned with them. Another storm. Another destruction. Another empire brought to the edge of the sea, and broken once again. 2 invasions, 2 storms, 1 message: Japan would not fall. Back on those same shores, the story began to change. The samurai no longer spoke of defeat. They no longer spoke of survival. They gave it a name: Kamikaze, the divine wind. Not just a storm, but a sign. A belief that something greater had protected them, that their land had been chosen, that their people had endured not by chance, but by fate. And that belief would echo through history. Takezaki would survive. He would return home, but he would not be the same man who once stood on that shore, waiting for a duel. He had seen a different kind of war, a war without rules, a war without honor, a war where survival mattered more than anything else, and he would carry that truth with him for the rest of his life. Because what happened here was more than a battle. It was a turning point, the moment when tradition collided with reality, when warriors were forced to change or be erased, and when the greatest empire on earth was stopped, not by swords, not by men, but by the wind. And as time moved forward, as wars continued, as new empires rose and old ones fell, one truth remained. No empire is unstoppable. No force is eternal. And sometimes, the greatest victories are not won by strength, but by survival.